Sir, my mom didn't come home last night. The billionaire froze, then followed the little girl inside. The first rays of dawn filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hartwell mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Alexander Hartwell stood in his study, nursing his third cup of coffee, reviewing contracts that would reshape his company's future. At 31, he had built an empire that most men could only dream of, yet lately, something felt hollow about his achievements. Perhaps it was the emptiness that echoed through the vast halls of his home, or maybe it was the realization that wealth couldn't fill certain voids in one's life. The mansion had 23 rooms, each more luxurious than the last, but it rarely felt like a home. That changed 6 months ago when he hired Elena Martinez as his live-in housekeeper. She was different from the parade of staff who had come and gone over the years. At 28, Elena carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect despite her circumstances. She worked tirelessly, never complained, and had transformed the cold mansion into something that almost felt warm. What truly brought life to the estate, however, was Elena's 3-year-old daughter, Lily. The little girl with her mother's dark curls and bright, curious eyes had become an unexpected source of joy in Alexander's structured life. He found himself looking forward to her cheerful, "Good morning, Mr. Alex," each day, and the way she would show him her drawings with such earnest pride. Elena worked 2 jobs to support her daughter. During the day, she managed the Hartwell household with impeccable efficiency, and most evenings, she worked at Morrison's Diner downtown. Alexander had offered to increase her salary so she wouldn't need the second job, but Elena politely declined, explaining that she needed to build her savings and maintain her independence. He respected that, even though it meant Lily spent many evenings in the care of Mrs. Patterson, the elderly cook who doted on the child. Elena typically returned around 11 each night, quietly slipping into the small but comfortable suite she shared with Lily in the mansion's west wing. Alexander often found himself staying up late in his study, telling himself it was work that kept him awake, but truthfully, he felt better knowing Elena had returned home safely. The neighborhood where the diner was located wasn't the best, and the thought of her walking to the bus stop late at night troubled him more than he cared to admit. Last night had been no different. Alexander had worked until midnight, periodically glancing at his watch. By 12:30, a vague sense of unease had begun to creep over him. Elena was never this late. By 1 o'clock, he had convinced himself she must have missed the last bus and decided to stay with a friend rather than make the expensive taxi ride. It was the logical explanation, he told himself, even as sleep eluded him for most of the night. Now, as morning light filled his study, Alexander heard small footsteps padding down the hallway. He recognized the pattern immediately. Lily's steps were lighter than any adult's, and she had a habit of dragging her right foot slightly when she was tired or upset. Something in the cadence of those footsteps made him set down his coffee and move toward the study door. When he opened it, he found Lily standing in the hallway, still in her pajamas decorated with little yellow ducks. Her dark curls were disheveled from sleep, and she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest. But it was her face that made Alexander's heart clench. Her large brown eyes were filled with tears, and her lower lip trembled as she tried to be brave. "Mr. Alex?" Her small voice wavered, barely above a whisper. Alexander immediately crouched down to her level, his business demeanor melting away. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Bad dream?" Lily shook her head, and a tear escaped down her round cheek. "Sir, my mom didn't come home last night." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. All the vague unease from the previous night crystallized into sharp, immediate concern. He kept his voice calm for Lily's sake, even as his mind began racing through possibilities. "Are you sure, Lily? Maybe she came home very late and is sleeping in." "I checked," Lily said, her voice breaking. "I woke up and called for her like I always do, but she wasn't there. Her bed is still made. She didn't come home, Mr. Alex. She always comes home. She promised she always would." The trust and fear in those words cut through Alexander's carefully constructed emotional barriers. This little girl, who had already been through so much in her young life, was experiencing every child's nightmare, a parent who didn't come home. He thought of Elena, who had once quietly shared with him during a rare conversation that she was divorced and that it hadn't been an amicable separation. She hadn't elaborated, and he hadn't pressed, respecting her privacy. "Come here," Alexander said gently, opening his arms. Lily didn't hesitate, dropping her rabbit and rushing into his embrace. He picked her up, feeling how small and fragile she was, how much she was trying not to completely fall apart. "We're going to figure this out, okay? Your mom is one of the strongest, most capable people I know. There has to be an explanation." But even as he spoke the words, a cold dread settled in his chest. Elena was reliable to a fault. She had never been late without calling, never missed a morning without prior notice, never broken a promise to her daughter. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. "Did your mom say anything yesterday? Anything unusual?" Alexander asked, carrying Lily toward the kitchen where Mrs. Patterson would already be preparing breakfast. Lily sniffled against his shoulder. "She said she loved me extra times before she left for the diner. And she looked sad, Mr. Alex. I asked her why, and she said grown-ups just feel sad sometimes, but everything would be okay." Alexander's jaw tightened. Elena had sensed something was wrong. His mind immediately went to the diner, to the late-night walk to the bus stop, to all the dangers a woman alone might face in that neighborhood. But there was something else tugging at his memory, a conversation from weeks ago when Elena had received a phone call that had visibly shaken her. When he'd asked if everything was all right, she'd simply said it was family matters and nothing to worry about. What if it wasn't nothing? Mrs. Patterson's face went pale when Alexander walked into the kitchen carrying a tearful Lily. The elderly cook had worked for the Hartwell family for over 20 years and had seen Alexander grow from an ambitious teenager to the man he was today. She had never seen quite this expression on his face, a mixture of concern, determination, and something that looked almost like fear. "Elena didn't come home last night," Alexander said without preamble, setting Lily down on one of the kitchen stools. "Mrs. Patterson, did she say anything to you yesterday? Anything that seemed off?" The cook's weathered hands clutched at her apron. "Oh my dear Lord. I knew something wasn't right. She seemed nervous all day yesterday, kept checking her phone. Around 3 in the afternoon, she got a call that made her go white as a sheet. When I asked what was wrong, she said it was nothing, just an old friend she hadn't expected to hear from." "What time did she leave for the diner?" Alexander pressed, his mind already forming a plan of action. 6 o'clock, same as always. But Mr. Hartwell, she asked me something strange before she left." Mrs. Patterson glanced at Lily, who was staring blankly at the table, then lowered her voice. "She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would make sure Lily was taken care of. She made me promise to tell you that you were the only person she trusted with her daughter's safety." The weight of those words settled over Alexander like a mantle he hadn't asked for but found himself ready to bear. "Did she mention any names? Any details?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head, but then paused. "Wait. I heard her on the phone, just a snippet before she realized I was nearby. She said something like, 'I told you, I don't have it anymore. You need to stop this.' Then she saw me and ended the call." Alexander's instincts, honed by years of negotiating with ruthless business competitors, told him this was far more serious than a simple accident or misunderstanding. This had the hallmarks of something planned, something threatening. He pulled out his phone and called Morrison's diner. After several rings, a gruff voice answered. "Morrison's, we're closed until 10. This is Alexander Hartwell. I need to speak to you about one of your employees, Elena Martinez. She didn't come home last night, and I need to know when she left your establishment." There was a pause, then the voice, presumably Mr. Morrison himself, took on a more serious tone. "Elena? She left around 10:30, same as always. Said goodnight to me, and went out the back in trance like she usually does to cut through to the bus stop. That was the last I saw of her. Is something wrong? Did you notice anyone hanging around outside? Anyone watching her? Now that you mention it." Morrison's voice grew thoughtful. "There was a guy who came in around 9. Didn't order much, just coffee. Kept looking out the window toward the back. Left about 15 minutes before Elena's shift ended. Didn't think much of it at the time, but it did strike me as odd. He kept staring at her whenever she passed by his booth. Can you describe him? Alexander's free hand clenched into a fist. Tall, maybe 6 feet. Dark hair, needed a shave. Had this angry look about him, you know? Like he was carrying a grudge. Wore a black jacket and jeans. Oh, and he had a scar on his left hand. Saw it when he paid. Alexander's mind raced. I need you to save any security footage you have from last night. I'll have someone there within the hour to collect it. This is extremely important. After ending the call, Alexander stood in the kitchen, his business acumen shifting into crisis management mode. He needed information, and he needed it fast. He called his head of security, Marcus Chen, who managed safety protocols for all Hartwell properties and had connections throughout the city. Marcus, I need a full background check on Elena Martinez, my housekeeper. And I need it in the next 30 minutes. Everything, previous addresses, family members, legal history, restraining orders, anything you can find. This isn't about vetting. She's missing, and I need to know what we're dealing with. Understood, sir. I'll have preliminary information to you within 20 minutes. Alexander ended the call and turned to find Lily watching him with those wide, fearful eyes. She had been so quiet he'd almost forgotten she was there, though that was impossible. He crossed to her and knelt down again, taking her small hands in his. Lily, I need you to be very brave and help me, okay? Can you do that? She nodded, though her chin still trembled. Has anyone ever come to visit your mom here at the house? Anyone she seemed afraid of? Lily thought carefully, her young face scrunched in concentration. Nobody visited. But sometimes when the phone rang, Mommy would get really scared. One time, she dropped a plate and it broke and she started crying. She told me it was because the plate was her favorite, but I think it was because of the phone call. Do you know who called? She would never say. But once, I heard her say a name when she was talking to herself after one of the calls. She said, Marcus needs to stop. But that's not the same Marcus as your Marcus, Mr. Alex, because your Marcus is nice. Alexander's blood ran cold. Marcus was a common enough name, but combined with Elena's fear, the threatening phone calls, and her comment about not having it anymore, this was painting a picture he desperately didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Mrs. Patterson handed him a cup of coffee he didn't remember her preparing. Mr. Hartwell, Elena's previous employer, before she came here, mentioned something to me once. I was getting her reference, making sure she was right for the position. The woman said Elena was an excellent worker, but had to leave suddenly due to personal safety concerns. She couldn't elaborate due to privacy, but she made sure I knew Elena was a good person who had been through something difficult. Before Alexander could respond, his phone rang. Marcus Chen's name flashed on the screen. Sir, I've got the preliminary information, and you need to hear this. Elena Martinez was married to Marcus Sullivan from 2020 to 2023. Divorced on grounds of domestic abuse. She filed 3 restraining orders against him, but he violated them twice. The last violation was 18 months ago. He showed up at her previous workplace. Charges were filed, but later dropped when Elena moved and changed jobs. I'm guessing she was trying to disappear. Current whereabouts of Marcus Sullivan? Alexander's voice was deadly calm, the tone he used when someone crossed a line in business. But this was infinitely more personal. That's the problem, sir. He was released from a 6-month sentence for the restraining order violation 3 weeks ago. Last known address is a halfway house downtown, but he hasn't checked in for his required meetings in 2 weeks. There's currently a bench warrant out for his arrest. 3 weeks. Elena had worked here for 6 months, which meant she'd built a safe, stable life for Lily only to have her dangerous past catch up with her. The phone call Elena had received, the fear in her eyes, the extra "I love yous" to her daughter. She had known he'd found her. Get me everything on Sullivan. Known associates, hangouts, previous arrests, everything. And Marcus, I need you and your team ready to move the moment we have a location. This man has Elena, and we're getting her back. Sir, with respect, this is a matter for the police. If this is a kidnapping, The police will be involved, but I'm not waiting for bureaucracy while Elena is in danger. Get me the information. That's not a request. After ending the call, Alexander dialed 911 and reported Elena missing, providing all the information he had. The dispatcher assured him an officer would be sent to take a statement, but he could hear the unspoken truth in her tone. Adults were often missing voluntarily, and it would take time before resources were dedicated to the search. Time Elena might not have. He looked at Lily, who had remained remarkably composed, her 3-year-old mind trying to process events far beyond her understanding. Lily's sweetheart, I need you to stay with Mrs. Patterson today, okay? I'm going to go find your mom and bring her home. You promise? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was enormous. This child had already experienced broken promises and disappointments in her short life. Alexander thought of all the business deals he'd closed with carefully worded language that left him escape routes and loopholes. He thought of the lawyers who would advise him never to make absolute commitments. Then he looked into Lily's eyes and saw complete trust, the kind that couldn't be earned with money or manipulation, but only through genuine care and integrity. I promise, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Alexander's Bentley cut through the morning traffic with precision as he headed toward Morrison's diner. In the passenger seat, Marcus Chun reviewed files on his tablet, building a profile of Marcus Sullivan that grew more disturbing with each detail. Sir, Sullivan has a history of escalating violence. Started with destruction of property, moved to assault. His sentence was actually reduced due to overcrowding and supposedly good behavior. The prosecution argued he was a danger to Elena specifically, but it wasn't enough to keep him locked up longer. Send everything to the detective assigned to Elena's case. I want them to have no doubt this is serious. Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He had faced boardroom battles with corporate sharks, had negotiated deals worth billions, had stared down hostile takeovers, but none of that had prepared him for this helpless rage at knowing someone he cared about was in danger, and he couldn't immediately fix it. When had Elena become someone he cared about? The question flickered through his mind before he pushed it aside. It didn't matter when it happened. What mattered was that a good woman and devoted mother was suffering because a violent man couldn't accept the end of a relationship. Morrison's Diner was a modest establishment wedged between a laundromat and a convenience store. Alexander had never actually seen where Elena worked her second job, and the sight of it, the worn vinyl booths, the cracked parking lot, the flickering neon sign, reminded him of how different their worlds were. Yet Elena had navigated both with equal grace. Jack Morrison was a barrel-chested man in his 60s who looked like he'd lived a hard life but maintained his principles. He had the security footage queued up on a laptop in his back office, and his face was grave. I've been running this place for 30 years, Morrison said, and I've learned to read people. Elena was one of the best workers I ever had. Never late, never complained, always kind to customers even when they didn't deserve it. If that bastard has hurt her. He didn't finish the sentence, but his clenched jaw said enough. The footage showed Elena moving through her shift with her characteristic efficiency. She smiled at customers, refilled coffee, delivered orders, all while carrying a tension in her shoulders that Alexander now recognized as fear. At 9:07 p.m., the camera captured a man entering and taking a booth with a clear view of the counter. That's him, Morrison confirmed. Gave me bad vibes from the moment he walked in. Alexander studied the man on screen. Marcus Sullivan was tall and lean, with the wiry build of someone who kept in shape with nervous energy rather than healthy habits. His face was angular, almost handsome, but there was something in his expression, a coiled resentment, that made Alexander's instincts scream danger. The footage showed Sullivan watching Elena with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. Not the appreciative look of someone admiring an attractive woman, but the possessive glare of someone who viewed her as property. Elena never once looked in his direction, but her movements became more rigid, more cautious. She knew he was there. At 10:17 p.m., Sullivan paid and left through the front door. At 10:31 p.m., Elena said goodbye to Morrison, grabbed her coat, and headed out the back exit. The diner's rear camera showed her stepping into the alley, pulling her coat tight against the October chill. She made it approximately 20 feet before a van pulled up alongside her. Alexander's blood turned to ice as he watched Sullivan jump out, grab Elena, and despite her obvious struggle, force her into the vehicle. The whole thing took less than 30 seconds. Then the van was gone, and the alley was empty except for Elena's purse, which had fallen during the struggle. "Did you call the police when she didn't show up for her next shift?" Marcus Chun asked Morrison. "She doesn't work on Thursdays. I wouldn't have known she was missing until tomorrow." Morrison's voice was thick with guilt. "I should have walked her to the bus stop. I always meant to, but she insisted she was fine, and I was tired." "This isn't your fault," Alexander said firmly, though his own sense of guilt was crushing. He should have insisted on driving Elena to and from the diner. He should have pressed her when she seemed frightened. He should have done 100 things differently. "Can you send this footage to the police and to this email address?" He handed Morrison a card. Back in the car, Alexander's phone rang. Detective Sarah Williams had been assigned to Elena's case, and she had reviewed the information he'd provided. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm treating this as an active kidnapping investigation. I've issued a bolo for Marcus Sullivan and his vehicle, a blue 2015 Dodge van registered in his name. We've got units checking his last known addresses, but I need to be straight with you. Sullivan is smart. He's evaded police before. He's likely taken her somewhere he feels he has control. Detective, with all due respect, likely isn't good enough. Elena has a 3-year-old daughter waiting for her mother to come home. What can I do?" There was a pause, and when Williams spoke again, her voice carried a note of respect. "I've read about you, Mr. Hartwell. You're known for solving problems others can't. But this isn't a business deal. Sullivan is dangerous, and if you interfere with police work, it could compromise the case or put Elena in more danger. What if I find information the police don't have access to? What if my resources can move faster than the system?" Another pause. "If you discover anything, you contact me immediately. No heroics. I've seen too many civilians get hurt trying to play detective." "Understood." "Understood." Alexander had no intention of staying on the sidelines, but he also knew the value of having law enforcement as allies rather than obstacles. Marcus Chen was already working his network, calling in favors from private investigators, security experts, and people who operated in the gray areas of information gathering. Within an hour, they had a list of properties associated with Sullivan: his parents' abandoned house in the suburbs, a storage unit he'd rented under a false name, and a cabin upstate that had belonged to his uncle. The cabin makes the most sense, Chen reasoned. It's isolated, off the grid, and according to property records, the uncle died 2 years ago, but the cabin hasn't been sold. Sullivan could be squatting there. Alexander was already programming the address into his GPS. How long a drive? 2.5 hours. "Sir, we should inform Detective Williams." "We will. Once we confirm Elena is there. I'm not sending police to raid an empty cabin while Sullivan gets spooked and moves her somewhere else." Alexander's voice brooked no argument. "Get your team ready to move. And Marcus? Bring everything we might need." Chen understood the implication. "Sir, if this goes wrong..." "It won't go wrong. Elena is counting on us, and I don't fail the people who trust me." As they drove north, leaving the city behind, Alexander found his thoughts drifting to Elena. He thought of her quiet strength, the way she hummed while she worked, how she always left a small vase of fresh flowers on his desk, a touch of warmth in his austere office. He thought of how she smiled at Lily, the fierce love in her eyes every time she looked at her daughter. He thought of the day, 3 months ago, when he'd found Elena crying in the kitchen late at night. She had apologized immediately, embarrassed to be caught in a vulnerable moment. He'd made her tea and, in a rare moment of openness, they'd talked about loneliness, his by choice, hers by necessity. She'd shared that leaving her marriage was the hardest thing she'd ever done, that she worried constantly about giving Lily a good life, that some days she was so tired she couldn't remember why she kept fighting. But then Lily laughs, Elena had said, and I remember exactly why. She deserves a life without fear, without violence, without learning that love means control. Whatever I have to do to give her that, I'll do it. Now, as bare trees blurred past the car windows and the city gave way to rural highways, Alexander understood that Elena had been running not just from her ex-husband, but towards something better for her daughter. She had built a life from nothing, had maintained her dignity despite working 2 jobs, had created moments of joy for Lily in the smallest things. And Marcus Sullivan had stolen that from her. "We're getting close," Chin announced. Studying the GPS, the cabin should be about 5 miles ahead, down a private road. "There's a delivery truck that serviced this area last night around 10:30. The driver reported seeing a blue van parked off the road near the cabin's turnoff, but didn't think anything of it at the time." Alexander's pulse quickened. They were close. Elena was close. The cabin sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow sound. It was exactly the kind of place someone would choose for isolation, for keeping someone hidden. A blue Dodge van was parked haphazardly near the sagging porch, partially concealed by overgrown shrubs. Alexander parked his Bentley a quarter-mile back, and he and Marcus Chen approached on foot, moving quietly through the underbrush. Chen's security team, 3 other men trained in protection and tactical operations, fanned out to cover the cabin's perimeter. These weren't soldiers or police, but they were professionals who understood the stakes. Through a grimy window, Alexander caught a glimpse of movement inside. His heart hammered against his ribs as he carefully raised himself to peer through the glass. Elena was there. She sat in a wooden chair in the center of a sparsely furnished room, her hands bound behind her back. Even from this distance, Alexander could see the bruise darkening her left cheek, the cut on her lip, the way she held herself with rigid determination despite obvious pain. Her work uniform from the diner was torn at the shoulder, and her dark hair, usually neatly pulled back, hung loose and disheveled. But what struck Alexander most was her expression. Despite everything, despite the fear that must be coursing through her, Elena's eyes burned with defiance. She wasn't broken. Not yet. Marcus Sullivan paced in front of her, his movements agitated, erratic. Alexander couldn't hear what he was saying, but the body language was clear. Sullivan was working himself into a rage, gesturing wildly, occasionally leaning into Elena's face to shout at her. "We need to call Detective Williams now," Chin whispered urgently. "This is beyond our scope." Alexander knew Chin was right. This was a job for trained law enforcement, for hostage negotiators, for people who dealt with dangerous criminals professionally. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to step back, make the call, and let the system work. But then Sullivan's hand shot out and struck Elena across the face, snapping her head to the side. Something cold and fierce crystallized in Alexander's chest. Rationality warred with rage, and in that moment, he understood what had always been an abstract concept: the primal need to protect someone you cared about, regardless of the cost. "Call Detective Williams," Alexander said quietly. "Give them the location. But we're not waiting. That's Elena in there, and every minute we wait is another minute she suffers." Chin looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Alexander's face stopped him. He pulled out his phone and made the call, speaking in low, urgent tones as he relayed the address and situation. Alexander studied the cabin's layout. It was a simple structure, maybe 4 rooms total. The main room where Elena was held, likely a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. 1 front door, 1 back door visible from this angle, and windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. Sullivan seemed to be alone, which was a small mercy, but he was clearly unstable, and unstable people were unpredictable. "Police are en route," Chin reported. "ETA 20 minutes. Detective Williams strongly advised we maintain position and wait." 20 minutes is too long. Alexander was already moving toward the cabin's rear entrance. "Sullivan is escalating. You see the way he's moving? He's working himself up to something worse. We need to get Elena out now." "Sir, this is insane. We're not equipped." "Then stay here and guide the police in when they arrive." "But I'm not leaving her in there." Alexander had never been in a physical fight in his adult life. His battles were waged in boardrooms, his weapons were contracts and capital. But as he carefully tested the cabin's back door and found it unlocked, He felt a clarity of purpose he'd never experienced in business. This wasn't about profit or pride. This was about saving someone who mattered. The back door opened into a small, filthy kitchen. The smell of mold and stale beer hit him immediately. Through a doorway, he could see into the main room where Sullivan continued his tirade. The man's back was to the kitchen, his attention fully on Elena. "Thought you could just leave me?" Sullivan was saying, his voice rising. "Thought you could take my kid and disappear? You humiliated me, Elena. Made me look like a fool in front of everyone. The restraining orders, the court dates, having cops show up at my job. You destroyed my life. You destroyed your own life, Marcus." Elena's voice was hoarse but steady. "I left because you hurt me. Because I was terrified you'd hurt Lily. Everything that happened to you was because of your choices, not mine." Sullivan's hand rose again, and Alexander moved, without thinking. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and caught Sullivan's wrist mid-swing. "That's enough," Alexander said, his voice carrying an authority honed by years of commanding boardrooms. Sullivan spun around, shock and rage contorting his features. He was slightly taller than Alexander, but Alexander had the advantage of surprise and purpose. For a frozen moment, the two men stared at each other. The billionaire who had everything and the ex-husband who had lost everything he thought he owned. "Who the hell are you?" Sullivan snarled, trying to yank his arm free. "Someone who's not going to let you hurt her anymore." Alexander shoved Sullivan backward, putting himself between the man and Elena. "This is over. The police are on their way. The best thing you can do is step outside and wait for them." Behind him, he heard Elena's sharp intake of breath. "Alexander, no. He has a knife. Please, just get out of here." But Alexander couldn't leave. Wouldn't leave. He saw the moment Sullivan's hand went to his pocket, saw the glint of metal as the knife came out. Time seemed to slow, and Alexander found himself thinking of Lily's face that morning, of her trust when he'd promised to bring her mother home. Sullivan lunged. Alexander had no training for this, no experience with physical violence beyond what he'd seen in movies. But he had clarity, and he had desperation. He twisted to the side, feeling the knife slice through his suit jacket and nick his arm. The pain was sharp but distant, adrenaline pushing it to the background of his awareness. They grappled, crashing into the wall. Alexander was dimly aware of Chun and his team bursting through the front door, of Elena shouting, of chaos erupting in the small cabin. Sullivan was wild, all manic energy and rage, but Alexander had something Sullivan lacked. He had something to lose. The knife clattered to the floor as Alexander landed a solid punch to Sullivan's jaw, his first punch ever, and it sent pain shooting through his knuckles. But Sullivan went down, and suddenly Chen's team was there, pinning the man to the floor, securing his hands with zip ties. Alexander stumbled toward Elena, his hands shaking as he worked at the ropes binding her wrists. "I've got you. You're safe. It's over." The moment her hands were free, Elena threw her arms around him, and Alexander felt her entire body trembling. She didn't cry, didn't break down, just held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted dangerously off its axis. "Lily," she whispered against his shoulder. "Is Lily okay?" "She's safe. She's with Mrs. Patterson. She's worried about you, but she's safe." Alexander pulled back just enough to see her face, to assure himself she was really here, really alive. The bruises on her face made him want to turn around and hit Sullivan again, but Elena was his priority. "We need to get you checked out by a doctor. You're hurt." "I'm fine," she insisted, though she swayed slightly as she stood. He wanted information about money I supposedly took when I left. Money that never existed. He convinced himself I'd stolen from him, that I was living some secret wealthy life, when I couldn't give him what he wanted. She touched her bruised cheek gingerly. The sound of sirens filled the air as police vehicles roared up the dirt road. Detective Williams was first through the door, her team moving with practiced efficiency to secure Sullivan and begin processing the scene. She took one look at Alexander's torn jacket and bleeding arm, at Elena's battered face, at Sullivan raging from the floor where Chen's team held him, and her expression hardened. "Mr. Hartwell, I specifically told you to wait for law enforcement. You also took 20 minutes to get here. Elena didn't have 20 minutes. Alexander kept his arm around Elena, supporting her weight as exhaustion and shock began to set in. Charge me with whatever you need to charge me with, detective, but she's safe. That's all that matters. Williams looked like she wanted to argue, but something in the scene, perhaps the protective way Alexander held Elena, or the obvious signs of Sullivan's violence, made her sigh instead. We'll sort out the details later. Right now, let's get both of you to the hospital. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was a blur of activity and antiseptic smells. Alexander sat on an examination table while a nurse cleaned and bandaged the knife wound on his arm. 6 stitches, the doctor informed him matter-of-factly, as if billionaires got into knife fights every day. The pain medication they'd given him made everything feel slightly unreal, or maybe that was just the aftermath of adrenaline. In the next room, separated only by a thin curtain, he could hear Elena being examined. The doctor's voice was gentle but clinical as she catalogued injuries, contusions, lacerations, signs of restrained trauma. Each injury described was like another knife wound to Alexander's conscience. If he'd acted sooner, if he'd pressed harder when Elena seemed afraid, if he'd simply been more aware. Mr. Hartwell? Detective Williams pulled back the curtain and sat in the plastic chair beside his bed. Her expression had softened somewhat from the hard professionalism at the cabin. I need to take your statement while it's fresh. Alexander walked her through everything, from Lily appearing at his study door that morning to the moment Sullivan had been subdued at the cabin. Williams took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her face remaining carefully neutral. You took a significant risk, she said finally. Sullivan could have killed you both. He was going to kill Elena anyway. I could see it in his body language, the way he was escalating. Would waiting for backup have been the proper procedure?
Probably.
But Elena would be dead, and I'd have to look her 3-year-old daughter in the eye and explain that her mother died because I followed protocol. Williams studied him for a long moment. You really care about her. Your employee. She's more than an employee. The words came out before Alexander could consider them, and once spoken, he realized how true they were. She's important.
To me.
To Lily. To the people whose lives she touches just by being kind and strong and refusing to let circumstances break her. Sullivan is being charged with kidnapping, assault, unlawful restraint, and violation of a restraining order. Given his history and the violence involved, the DA is confident he'll be denied bail. Elena will need to testify eventually, but for now, she's safe from him. He's going away for a very long time. After Williams left, Alexander sat in silence, processing everything that had happened in the past 16 hours. Less than a day ago, his biggest concern had been a merger negotiation. Now, he'd physically fought a man, risked his life, and discovered that the carefully constructed walls around his heart weren't as impenetrable as he'd believed. Alexander. Elena's voice came from beyond the curtain, soft and uncertain. He immediately stood, pulling back the curtain to find her sitting on her own examination table, looking small in a hospital gown, her face now cleaned of blood but the bruises standing out in stark relief against her olive skin. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear, and she offered him a tentative smile. They said you fought Marcus. You actually fought him. There was wonder in her voice, and something else, something that made Alexander's heart beat faster.
Why?
Why would you risk yourself for me? Alexander crossed to her, taking the seat beside her bed. The words he needed to say lodged in his throat, tangled up with years of emotional guardedness and fear of vulnerability. But Elena had been vulnerable, had trusted him to save her, and she deserved honesty in return. When Lily told me you didn't come home, he began, choosing each word carefully, it was like someone had pulled the ground out from under me. I realized in that moment that my mansion, my company, all the things I thought mattered, none of it meant anything without you there. You and Lily, you've made my house feel like a home. You've made me remember what it's like to care about something beyond profit margins and stock prices. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I never meant to bring danger into your life. When Marcus found me, when he started calling, I should have told you. I should have asked for help. But I was so used to handling everything alone, so afraid that if you knew about my past, you'd see me as damaged or dangerous or… Elena. Alexander took her hand, careful of the foreline. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You left an abusive marriage, built a life for your daughter, maintained your dignity while working 2 jobs, and even when you were terrified, you never stopped fighting. That's not damaged. That's extraordinary. A tear escaped down her cheek. I was so scared. When Marcus grabbed me, all I could think about was Lily. What would happen to her if I didn't come back? Who would love her the way she deserves to be loved? Mrs. Patterson is wonderful, but she's not family, and my parents disowned me when I married Marcus. Lily would have no one. She would have had me. The words came out fierce and certain. Elena, I made Lily a promise this morning that I would bring her mother home. But if the worst had happened, if I couldn't keep that promise, I would have made sure she was loved and cared for. She would never have been alone. Elena's hand tightened around his. When you came through that door at the cabin, when you stood between me and Marcus, I couldn't believe it. In my marriage, I learned that I was on my own, that no one would protect me, that strength meant never expecting help. But you came for me. You actually came. I always will, Alexander said quietly. Elena, I know this isn't the time and you've been through trauma and the last thing you need is complicated emotions from your employer. But I need you to know that these past months, having you and Lily in my life, have changed me. I've been going through the motions for years, achieving success, but feeling empty. You've reminded me what matters. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those dark, expressive eyes. You're right that this isn't the perfect time. I have trauma to process, a legal case to deal with, and a daughter who needs to understand that her mother is safe. But Alexander, you should also know that every day when I came back from the diner late at night, knowing you were awake in your study, it made me feel safe. I would see your light on, and I'd think, I'm home. Not just to a house, but home. The curtains suddenly flew open, and a nurse appeared with discharge papers. Ms. Martinez, you're all set to go. We've prescribed pain medication and antibiotics for your injuries. You'll need to follow up with your primary care physician in 1 week. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to speak with a counselor about what you've been through. Trauma has lasting effects, and I'll make sure she has access to the best counselors available, Alexander interjected. Whatever she needs. The nurse looked between them, seeming to reassess their relationship, then nodded approvingly. Good. She'll need support. You both will, actually. It's not every day you rescue someone from a kidnapping. An hour later, they were in Alexander's Bentley heading back to the city. Elena had called Mrs. Patterson from the hospital, speaking to Lily and assuring her daughter that she was fine and would be home soon. The relief in Lily's voice had made Elena cry again, and Alexander had given her the privacy of turning away while keeping a supportive hand on her shoulder. Now, as the city skyline came into view, Elena broke the comfortable silence. I need to find a new place to live. I can't put you and your household at risk anymore. Marcus is in jail, but he has friends, people who might. Elena, stop. Alexander's voice was firm. First, Marcus Sullivan isn't getting out of jail for a very long time. Second, if you think I'm letting you and Lily leave when you've both just been through trauma, you seriously underestimate my stubbornness. Third, he paused, checking his mirrors to change lanes, but really to gather courage. Third, I don't want you to leave. Not now, not when things settle down, not ever. Alexander, I know what you're going to say. That it's not appropriate, that you work for me, that there's a power imbalance. You're right about all of it. So here's what I'm proposing. You keep your salary and your living arrangement for as long as you want them. No strings, no pressure, no expectations beyond what we've already had. But Elena, I'm also asking permission to spend time with you and Lily outside of our professional relationship. To take Lily to the park, to have dinner together as something more than employer and employee. To see where this could go. Elena was quiet for so long that Alexander thought he'd misread everything, that his feelings were one-sided, that he'd made a terrible mistake by being honest. But then she spoke, her voice soft but sure. Lily asks about you all the time. She wants to know if you'll play tea party with her, if you'll read her bedtime stories, if you think she draws good pictures. She's never had that. A man in her life who treats her with kindness and patience. Marcus was never. He was never a real father to her, even when we were together. I'd be honored to play tea party and read stories, Alexander said, and meant it. But, Elena, I need to know what you want. Not what you think you should do, not what seems most practical, but what you actually want. She turned in her seat to look at him fully, and despite the bruises, despite the exhaustion in her eyes, she was beautiful. I want not be afraid anymore. I want Lily to grow up knowing that love doesn't hurt. I want to believe that good things can happen, that not every person will let me down. And I think I want to find out if what I feel when I'm around you is just gratitude or something more. We can take it slow, Alexander promised. As slow as you need. Okay, Elena said simply. But Alexander? Thank you. For coming for me. For risking yourself. For seeing me as more than just someone who cleans your house. That means more than you could possibly know. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself. When Alexander and Elena walked through the mansion's front door, the entryway was filled with flowers, simple daisies and cheerful sunflowers, the kind that reminded everyone that beauty didn't have to be expensive to be meaningful. The elderly cook stood in the hallway, Lily clutching her hand, both of them looking anxiously toward the door. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Lily's face crumpled, and she launched herself forward with a cry of "Mommy." Elena dropped to her knees just in time to catch her daughter, wrapping her arms around the little girl and holding on like she'd never let go. Lily was crying, Elena was crying, and even Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Alexander stood back, giving them their moment, but found his own vision blurring. "You came back," Lily sobbed into her mother's shoulder. "I was so scared you wouldn't come back. Baby, I will always come back to you. Always. No matter what, I will always find my way back to you." Elena pulled back just enough to cup her daughter's face in her hands. "And you know who made sure I could come back? Mr. Alex. He's a hero, Lily. A real hero." Lily turned to look at Alexander, her tear-streaked face solemn. Then, with the uncomplicated trust of a 3-year-old, she left her mother's arms and walked to Alexander. She looked up at him for a long moment, then raised her arms in the universal signal for "pick me up." Alexander lifted her carefully, acutely aware of how precious this small person was, how much responsibility rested in holding her. Lily wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered in his ear, "Thank you for bringing my mommy home. You're my favorite person besides Mommy and Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Buttons." Mr. Buttons, Alexander had learned, was her stuffed rabbit. "You're one of my favorite people too," Alexander whispered back and realized it was true. The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Elena needed time to recover, both physically and emotionally, and Alexander insisted she take it. He canceled his meetings, postponed his business trips, and for the first time in his professional life, made his personal life the priority. Detective Williams called with updates. Mark Sullivan had been officially charged. The district attorney was pursuing maximum sentences, and Elena's restraining order had been updated to be permanent. Elena would need to testify eventually, but with the evidence and Sullivan's prior record, the case was solid. Alexander also hired the best trauma counselor in the city to work with Elena and a child psychologist to help Lily process what had happened in age-appropriate ways. He made it clear to both professionals that cost was no object. Whatever Elena and Lily needed, they would have. But more than the practical support, he gave them his time. He taught Lily to play chess using pieces. She decorated herself with markers. He read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, making Lily giggle. He sat with Elena in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes just being present while she processed her trauma. One evening, about a week after the rescue, Alexander found Elena in the mansion's library. She stood by the window overlooking the garden, now transitioning into late autumn. She'd removed the bandage from her healing lip, and the bruises on her face had faded to yellowing shadows. "Penny for your thoughts?" Alexander asked, joining her at the window. Elena smiled slightly. I was just thinking about how different my life was this time last year. I was living in a tiny apartment, working 3 jobs to make rent, terrified every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. I couldn't imagine anything better. I'd convinced myself that survival was the same as living. And now I'm standing in a mansion, working for a man who risked his life to save mine, and my daughter is happy. She laughs every day. She feels safe. That's not something I ever thought I could give her. Elena turned to face him. You changed our lives, Alexander. You gave us more than just safety. You gave us hope. You gave me something too, Alexander said quietly. Purpose. Connection. You and Lily, you reminded me that all the success in the world doesn't mean anything if you have no one to share it with. My house was just a building before you came. Now it's a home. Alexander, I've been thinking about what you said at the hospital. About spending time together, seeing where things might go. Elena's voice was steady, but her eyes showed vulnerability. I'm scared. Not of you, but of trusting again. Of opening myself up to being hurt. Marcus destroyed my ability to believe in partnership, in the idea that someone could love me without trying to control me. I know. Alexander kept his distance, giving her space. And I would never push you into anything you're not ready for. But Elena, I want you to know that love, real love, isn't about control. It's about wanting someone to be their fullest, freest self. It's about supporting their dreams even when they don't align with your own convenience. It's about showing up day after day, not because you have to, but because you can't imagine doing anything else. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad tears. When did you become so wise about love? When I met you, Alexander said simply. You taught me what it looks like. The way you love Lily, that fierce, protective, nurturing love that asks nothing in return, that's what love should be.
I want to learn to love like that.
Elena crossed the distance between them, taking his hands in hers. I can't promise I won't be scared sometimes. I can't promise I won't have bad days where the trauma resurfaces. I can't promise this will be easy. I don't want easy, Alexander said, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her hands. I want real. I want you, with all your strength and all your scars. I want Lily's laughter in these halls. I want messy breakfasts and bedtime stories and ordinary moments that turn out to be extraordinary because we're living them together. Okay, Elena whispered. Okay, let's see where this goes. But slowly. One day at a time. One day at a time, Alexander agreed. Then, with a gentleness that belied his usual commanding presence, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. It wasn't passionate or demanding. It was a promise. Of patience, of respect, of something building between them that couldn't be rushed or forced. Elena rested her head against his chest, and they stood like that for a long moment, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, both learning to believe that happiness wasn't something that happened to other people. 3 months later, snow fell softly outside the mansion's windows. Inside, the house was alive with warmth and laughter. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Hartwell had a family to celebrate with. Lily was in the living room, her eyes wide with wonder at the enormous Christmas tree Alexander had let her help decorate. It was covered in an eclectic mix of expensive ornaments and handmade decorations Lily had crafted, glitter-covered paper stars, popsicle stick frames with family photos, and a lopsided angel that held the place of honor at the top. Mr. Alex, look. Santa's going to see our tree from space. Lily exclaimed, bouncing with excitement. He definitely will, Alexander agreed, crouching down beside her. Over the past months, Mr. Alex had gradually shortened to just Alex in Lily's vocabulary, a small change that meant everything to him. Elena emerged from the kitchen carrying mugs of hot chocolate, a sight that still made Alexander's heart skip a beat. She'd let her hair grow longer, and she smiled more easily now. The shadows in her eyes hadn't completely disappeared. Trauma didn't work that way, but they'd lessened. She'd been seeing Dr. Richardson weekly, and the counseling had helped her process not just the kidnapping, but years of abuse she'd endured before. "Careful, they're hot," Elena warned, handing mugs to both Alexander and Lily. She'd made Lily's with extra marshmallows, just the way the little girl liked it. "Elena, this is perfect," Alexander said, gesturing to the room. The mansion's usual austere elegance had been softened by Christmas decorations, garland on the staircase, stockings hung by the fireplace, including ones for Mrs. Patterson and Marcus Chen, and family photos scattered throughout the room. "It's our home," Elena said simply, settling beside him on the couch. "That's what makes it perfect." The past 3 months had been a journey for all of them. Elena had decided to quit her job at the diner, accepting Alexander's offer of a salary increase. But more importantly, she'd started taking online business classes, nurturing a dream she'd set aside years ago to open a small bakery. Alexander had watched with pride as she threw herself into her studies, her natural intelligence and determination shining through. For his part, Alexander had restructured his work schedule, delegating more to his executives and discovering that his company ran perfectly well without his constant oversight. He made it home for dinner every night, read Lily bedtime stories, and spent his evenings talking with Elena about everything and nothing, her classes, his business challenges, their hopes for the future. They'd taken things slowly, just as Elena needed. Their relationship had progressed from employer-employee to friends to something deeper, but always at Elena's pace. They held hands during their evening walks through the garden. They talked about their fears and dreams and the people they wanted to become. Alexander had met Elena's estranged parents at her request, a difficult meeting where Elena stood up to them with newfound strength, explaining that their daughter and granddaughter were part of her life now, and they could either be supportive or stay away. Her mother had cried and apologized. Her father had been more resistant, but seeing his granddaughter had softened him. Healing those relationships would take time, but at least the door was open. "Alex." Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Is it okay if I call you Daddy?" The room went completely silent. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. Alexander felt his heart stop, then start again, beating harder than it ever had during any business negotiation or high-stakes deal. "Lily's sweetheart, that's something you should talk to your mommy about," Alexander managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "I already did," Lily said matter-of-factly. "She said it was up to you. So, is it okay? Because you do daddy things. You read me stories and play with me and you make mommy smile, and you saved her from the bad man. That's what daddies do, right?" Alexander looked at Elena, whose eyes were swimming with tears but who nodded encouragingly. He thought about his own father, a cold man who'd valued business success over family connection, who'd never played games or read bedtime stories, who'd viewed parenting as a duty rather than a joy. Alexander had sworn he'd never be like that, which was partly why he'd never had children of his own. But here was this little girl, who'd come into his life by chance, who'd taught him what unconditional love looked like, who'd made him want to be better, do better, live better. Here was the chance to be the father he'd never had, to show a child that she was valued and loved and worthy simply because she existed. "Lily," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored if you called me Daddy. There's nothing in this world that would make me happier." Lily launched herself into his arms, hot chocolate sloshing dangerously.
"Daddy."
"I have a daddy now. Wait until I tell Mrs. Patterson." She scrambled off his lap and ran toward the kitchen, calling for the cook. Alexander and Elena were left alone in the living room, Christmas lights twinkling, snow falling outside, their whole world having just shifted on its axis in the best possible way. "Alexander," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Are you sure? This is a huge commitment. Being Lily's father, it's not something you can take back if you change your mind." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Alexander pulled Elena into his arms, holding her close. "You and Lily, you're my family now. Not because of circumstance or obligation, but because I choose you. Every day, I choose you." Elena looked up at him, her face radiant despite the tears. "I love you. I've been afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or too complicated, or that I was confusing gratitude with love. But it's not gratitude. It's love. Real, messy, imperfect, beautiful love. I love you too, Alexander said, and then he kissed her properly for the first time. Not a gentle forehead kiss or a brief goodnight kiss, but a real kiss that spoke of promises and possibilities and a future they would build together. When they pulled apart, Lily was standing in the doorway with Mrs. Patterson, both of them grinning knowingly. "Are you guys going to get married?" Lily asked with the bluntness of a 3-year-old. "Because if you do, I want to be the flower girl. And I want a purple dress. And can we have cake? I really want cake." Alexander and Elena laughed, the sound filling the mansion with joy. "One step at a time, sweetheart," Elena said, but she looked at Alexander with a smile that suggested marriage might not be as far in the future as practical timing would suggest. Later that night, after Lily had finally been convinced to go to bed, with the promise that Santa would only come as she was sleeping, Alexander and Elena stood by the window in his study, watching snow blanket the gardens in white. "A year ago, I was alone in this house," Alexander said quietly. "I had everything money could buy, and nothing that actually mattered. I thought I was content. I thought success was enough." "What changed?" Elena asked, though she knew the answer. "A little girl knocked on my study door and told me her mom didn't come home. And in that moment, I realized that somewhere along the way, you and Lily had become the most important people in my world. Everything else, the company, the money, the success I'd spent years building, none of it meant anything without you." Elena took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "You know what the best part is? I don't think you saved me that day at the cabin. I think we saved each other. You saved me from Marcus, but I saved you from a life where you had everything except the things that actually make life worth living." "You're right," Alexander agreed. "We saved each other." They stood there in comfortable silence, two people who'd found their way to each other through pain and fear, and ultimately through the courage to be vulnerable. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in fresh whiteness. Inside, the mansion that had once been just a showcase of wealth had been transformed into a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of all the tomorrows they would face together. In the distance, they could hear Lily talking in her sleep, probably dreaming of Christmas morning. Mrs. Patterson was humming in the kitchen as she prepared tomorrow's feast. The mansion's halls, once so empty and echoing, now resonated with life and warmth. Alexander pulled Elena closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Merry Christmas, Elena." "Merry Christmas, Alexander," she replied, then smiled. "Merry Christmas, Daddy." He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I'm never going to get tired of hearing that." "Good," Elena said, "because Lily's going to say it about 1,000 times a day." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, both of them understood something profound. True wealth wasn't measured in money or mansions or business empires. True wealth was measured in moments like these, in the love of a good woman, in the trust of a child, in the transformation of a house into a home, in the courage to open your heart even when you've been hurt, in the strength to believe that happy endings weren't just for fairy tales. They had both been broken in their own ways, Elena by abuse and fear, Alexander by isolation and emotional emptiness. But broken things, when pieced together with love and patience and genuine care, could become even more beautiful than they'd been before. The cracks weren't weaknesses, they were proof of survival, evidence of strength, and the places where light could shine through. As snow continued to fall outside and Christmas lights twinkled throughout the mansion, Alexander Hartwell and Elena Martinez stood together, no longer a billionaire and his employee, but simply two people who'd found in each other the courage to believe in love again. And somewhere in the house, a 3-year-old girl slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she had a mother who'd fight through anything to protect her and a father who'd chosen to love her unconditionally. It wasn't the end of their story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead. Elena's continued healing from trauma, the complexities of blending their lives, the inevitable ups and downs that came with any relationship. But they would face those challenges together as a family. and that, more than any business success or material possession, was everything.